When you serve your country, you expect at the very least to come home to the place you left behind. My home wasn't a mansion, but it was mine. Every wall, every corner carried memories I had built before leaving on deployment. So when I finally returned, I expected the familiar sense of comfort. Instead, I pulled into my own driveway and saw strangers walking in and out of my house like it was theirs. At first, I thought maybe I had the wrong place, but my gut told me something was very, very wrong. As I looked closer, I realized this wasn't a break-in. Furniture was moved, decorations were changed, and the entire house looked like it had been rented out. Confused and angry, I went to the HOA, thinking it had to be a misunderstanding. That's when the truth came crashing down. Without my permission, while I was overseas serving my country, the HOA had decided my home was unused property. They rented it out to strangers, pocketed the money, and acted as if I had no say in it. I can't describe the mix of betrayal and shock I felt in that moment. To think the very people who were supposed to look after the community had taken advantage of my absence. And it wasn't just about me, it was about principle. You can't steal someone's home and expect them to stay silent. So I made a call. Not just to a lawyer, not just to the authorities, but to my brothers and sisters who stood beside me during deployment. My platoon wasn't about to let this go quietly. What happened next was something the HOA never saw coming, and it changed everything. Would you like me to continue writing the next 300-word main story part after this intro? I stood there in disbelief, watching people who had no connection to me moving around inside my house like it belonged to them. A couple was sitting on the porch sipping coffee, kids' toys were scattered in the yard, and a moving van was parked nearby. Everything about it felt wrong. I wanted to rush in and demand answers, but I also knew I needed to understand how deep this went before making my move. The HOA wasn't just bending the rules, they had crossed a line no one ever should. Over the years, I had heard stories about HOAs getting too much power, but I never thought it could happen to me. My neighbors later told me the board members claimed I had abandoned the property. They even drafted a notice saying they had the right to lease it out in order to maintain community value. It was shocking to learn how casually they had signed away my home to strangers without a single phone call, letter, or attempt to reach me while I was deployed. Every corner of the neighborhood started to look different now. People who had been friendly before looked nervous when they saw me, as if they knew what was going on, but didn't want to get involved. Some avoided eye contact altogether. Others quietly warned me that the HOA had been getting bolder in recent years, pushing around anyone who questioned their authority. That was when I realized this wasn't just about money or my house, it was about control. The HOA believed they could act without consequences, even against someone serving their country. The more I dug into it, the clearer it became that this wasn't an isolated mistake. And if they thought I was going to accept it quietly, they had no idea what was coming next. Do you want me to now write the 300-word climax section where your platoon steps in and the confrontation escalates? The more I looked into the situation, the more tangled it became. The family staying in my home told me they had signed a lease with the HOA, not realizing the house actually belonged to me. They had paperwork, receipts, even emails showing the board members arranging everything. On paper, it almost looked legitimate, which only made my blood boil more. How could they pull this off so smoothly without anyone questioning it? Behind the scenes, I started piecing together how the HOA had been running things while I was away. Apparently, this wasn't the first time they had stepped into someone's personal property. A neighbor whispered that a similar thing had happened to an elderly couple down the street, but they had been too tired and overwhelmed to fight back. Another neighbor mentioned how fines and fees were piling up for small infractions, making people desperate to stay in the board's good graces. It was like the HOA had built a quiet system of control, using rules as weapons. Meanwhile, my platoon kept checking in with me. They weren't just brothers in arms. They were family. Some of them had seen the photos I sent and couldn't believe what was happening. To them, it wasn't only about my house, it was about how someone could exploit the absence of a soldier serving overseas. That struck a nerve with all of us. The deeper I dug, the more I realized this wasn't just going to be solved with a few phone calls. The HOA wasn't backing down, and the tenants living in my home were caught in the middle of something they never signed up for. The question wasn't whether to fight back, It was how far this would go before the truth finally came out. Do you want me to now write the 300-word climax section where the confrontation with the HOA reaches its breaking point? It didn't take long before the HOA realized I wasn't going to just walk away quietly. Every time I asked for answers, they dodged me with excuses, hiding behind complicated language and community guidelines. But the more they tried to push me off, the more determined I became. My phone was filled with photos, emails, and witness accounts, all painting the same picture. This wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. They had turned my home into a business while I was gone, and now they were scrambling to cover their tracks. The tension in the neighborhood started to build. Some neighbors slipped me copies of notices the HOA had sent them, proof that the board had been threatening people with fines and foreclosure if they spoke out. A few even confessed that they had been warned not to get involved with my situation. It felt like the entire community was living in fear of the very people who were supposed to protect it. At night, I'd sit in my truck across the street from my own house, watching strangers walk in and out of a place I had worked so hard to build. The porch light glowed, but it didn't feel like home anymore. My platoon stayed in touch daily, their voices steady, reminding me that I wasn't in this fight alone. They were waiting for the word, ready to back me up when the time came. The HOA thought they had the upper hand, but what they didn't understand was that I wasn't fighting just for myself. I was fighting for every person they had pushed around. And as their lies unraveled, it became clear that the showdown was coming. The question was no longer if it would happen, but when and how explosive it would be. Do you want me to now write the 300-word climax scene where everything comes to a head? Just when I thought I had gathered enough evidence to finally pin the HOA down, another twist surfaced that made the situation even darker. While going through some of the documents my neighbor had slipped under my door, I noticed a name that didn't belong. One of the tenants living in my house wasn't just a random renter. They had ties to one of the board members. It suddenly made sense why everything had been pushed through so quickly and why my complaints were being brushed aside. This wasn't about maintaining community value. It was about personal profit and connections. The realization hit me hard. Not only had they rented out my home without my permission, but they had done it to benefit themselves directly. It was like a carefully crafted scheme, one they assumed I would never uncover. The more I pieced together, the more it felt like the HOA had been running a shadow operation, using their authority to shuffle homes, lease properties, and pocket the money. My house wasn't the first, and if I didn't stop it, it definitely wouldn't be the last. The tension only escalated when one of the tenants approached me quietly and admitted they had started receiving strange late-night calls from the HOA, warning them not to speak with me. They looked nervous, almost guilty, as if they had finally realized they were trapped in the middle of something much bigger than a rental dispute. That confession changed everything. Now, it wasn't just about me reclaiming my home, it was about exposing the entire operation. The stakes had doubled, and the risks were higher than ever. I knew that if I pushed forward, there was no turning back. And as the pieces started falling into place, I could feel the breaking point closing in. Do you want me to now take this into the full 300-word climax scene where the confrontation finally erupts? The breaking point came faster than I expected. After weeks of stonewalling, the HOA called for an emergency board meeting, clearly thinking they could silence me once and for all. What they didn't know was that I wasn't walking in alone. My platoon had flown in, not in uniform, but standing tall beside me as brothers who had my back. The moment we entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. The board members who had been so smug before suddenly looked uneasy, realizing this wasn't going to be another meeting they could control. I laid out everything: copies of the leases, the financial records, and the tenant's confession. Piece by piece, their carefully built facade crumbled in front of the very people they had been intimidating for years. Neighbors who had been silent out of fear started speaking up, confirming their own stories of fines, threats, and shady dealings. It was no longer just my fight, the entire community was standing together. For the first time, the HOA had nowhere to hide. The climax came when one of the tenants revealed an email chain that directly tied the board president to the illegal rental scheme. Gasps filled the room, and even the board's loyal supporters couldn't deny what was in black and white. The president tried to cut the meeting short, but it was too late. The truth was out. Just when it seemed like justice had been served, the final twist landed. A quiet board member, who had barely spoken until that moment, suddenly admitted they had been keeping records of everything for years. They handed me a flash drive saying, "This goes deeper than you think." I had reclaimed my home, but now I was staring at evidence of something much bigger. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. Do you want me to now write the final 300-word resolution and reflection to close the story powerfully? When the meeting ended, I walked back into my neighborhood with a mix of relief and disbelief. My home was finally mine again, but the truth about the HOA was bigger than I ever imagined. The flash drive turned out to hold years of records, leases, hidden accounts, even emails that showed how far their influence had spread. It was proof that what happened to me wasn't an accident, but part of a larger pattern. The community had been living under their control without even realizing the extent of it. With the evidence out in the open, neighbors who had once stayed silent now found their voices. The couple down the street, who had almost lost their home, finally spoke up. Others who had been buried under unfair fines stepped forward too. What began as my personal battle turned into a community effort to take back our rights. It wasn't quick or easy, but together we pushed for change. The board members responsible were removed, and new leadership was chosen, people who actually cared about the neighborhood instead of their own pockets. As for me, reclaiming my home was more than just getting my property back. It reminded me of why I had joined the service in the first place, to protect what mattered. Coming back to see my platoon by my side and my community finally standing together made it clear that strength doesn't just come from fighting battles overseas. Sometimes, it's about facing the ones right in front of you. In the end, the biggest takeaway wasn't about revenge or payback. It was about standing up when something isn't right, no matter how overwhelming it feels. Because if you don't protect what's yours, someone else will try to take it. And this time, they picked the wrong person.